Hi, Danielle Smith again. And I must tell you, one of my great pleasures when I was in radio was I got the opportunity to interview our next guest several times. He came onto my radar screen in a documentary he was in about nuclear energy, which surprisingly changed my views quite a bit on the approach to nuclear. He also wrote some pretty challenging articles in Forbes and Quillette on the issue of the Amazon forest fires, taking quite a different take. But I think you'll probably know him now for the international acclaim / furor he got over his recent book. Michael Shellenberger is the author of the internationally best-selling book, Apocalypse Never: Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All. You can get it through HarperCollins. He is president of Environmental Progress and a Time Magazine Hero of the Environment. He has been an environmental worker rights and criminal justice advocate for 30 years, and since 2016, he's helped prevent the loss of over 24 nuclear reactors around the world. He's a journalist, a frequent contributor. You will see him in New York Times, Forbes, and Quillette magazine. He's also currently writing a book on addiction, mental illness, and the housing crisis in California. Michael Shellenberger, thank you so much for being with us today.
I'm so excited to be with you.
Well, I want to start by talking about, I read a really interesting review on your book. It wasn't altogether flattering, but it did sort of describe this world of this battle that we're having between the Malthusians and the cornucopians, the idea that there is a scarcity attitude among the environmental activists, that we don't have enough world to go around, and those of us who are on sort of the abundant side, thinking we can solve whatever problems that we're confronted with, and we can make better use of resources. Do you think that is an accurate way to describe the battle that we're fighting right now?
I think it's fair. I mean, it's remarkable what the trends have been. So we've seen extreme poverty globally decline from 44% to 10%. Over the last 40 years, infant mortality has declined so dramatically. We're having fewer kids. We invest more in them. We spoil them now. That's our problem. We eat too much. We have too much food. We produce 25% more food than we need. Those are the biggest food surpluses in world history. Fewer people than ever are dying from natural disasters. The decline has been 99% basically everywhere. But even just over the last 40 years, 50 years, 99% declines in deaths from hurricanes and cyclones in places like Bangladesh. So there's so many positive trends. Many of the other questions that we're dealing with, we're also making pretty good headway. The United States, for example, and Canada as well, have reduced our carbon emissions significantly over the last 20 years. The United States reduced its carbon emissions more than any other country in the world. Over the last 20 years, we're on track to meet our Paris and Copenhagen climate agreements. The United States is actually the global climate leader. It's quite a reversal of fortunes over when just 20 years ago, the United States was being demonized and villainized as a climate bad guy. And that's mostly because of fracking. It's mostly because of fracking for natural gas. So it's hard to look at trends like that and be so pessimistic about humankind's future and our potential for flourishing.
It's interesting to me because your book came out just after Michael Moore and Jeff Gibbs' movie about looking at the truth of wind and solar and the intermittency and the fact that it can't provide reliable energy. But I think you have quite different conclusions. That film, Planet of the Humans, concluded there's just too many people on the planet. And I wonder if you can address that, because intuitively, that sounds like it makes sense. There has to be a limit to how much the planet can support. We've seen a massive growth in population in the last 100 years. Surely it can't keep growing at that rate. How do you come at that issue?
Well, I just ask everybody to kind of, pick up your cell phone and you kind of go, this used to be a fax machine. I say fax machine and my Zoomer friends and colleagues don't know what I'm talking about. Cameras, stereo systems, speakers. This is a product of radical technological innovation, what we call dematerialization. The same thing occurs in every part of the economy. We produce 300% more food than we did in 1961, only having increased the amount of land we use by 8%. How is that possible? Because we use fertilizer and irrigation and tractors. It's, technological change is the main event for both economic growth and environmental protection. And in fact, we didn't reduce our carbon emissions more than any other country in the world by having degrowth. We did it through economic growth. We did it through prosperity. I think that people that care about prosperity, that and abundance and free markets, we should talk about how remarkable these technological changes have been. You know, the amount of land that we use, for one more statistic, that we use for producing beef has declined by an area almost the size of Alaska since the year 2000. The reason that matters is that meat production is our single largest use of the earth. We humans use about half the ice-free surface of the earth, and half of that half is just for beef production. So to so significantly increase beef production while reducing the amount of land we use is an incredible environmental success that we should build upon.
Can you talk about that one? Because I think you got a lot of pushback on your column that you originally wrote for Forbes, and I think it ultimately got republished in Quillette, where you sort of reframed some of the issue around the loss of the Amazon rainforest. And I wouldn't mind if you'd make that argument, because I think what you've said is probably so shocking to people, since we've seen an anti-beef movement also hit Canada as well. Tell us, is that an example of where maybe the environmentalists are right, or is there another way of looking at that issue too?
Yeah, I mean, on the fundamental question of if you want to leave more habitat and nature, more environment for endangered species, then we need to just produce food on smaller amounts of land. That's the most important thing. Cities only take up about 0.5% of the Earth's surface. They're not a big use of land. It's mostly in food production. So if you care about a place like the Amazon, what we should want is to produce more food in the southern savanna south of the Amazon rainforest, which is perfect for growing soy and beef. And you should want to concentrate production in a smaller amount of land. What Greenpeace and other radical environmental groups, and unfortunately deeply ignorant ones, have done instead is they've demanded that farmers fragment their farms out of this idea that if each farmer sets aside 10 or 20% of his land, but the problem is that just results in more forest fragmentation. So this simple idea has been this, which is that you want to produce more food on less land, or the same thing with energy. You want to produce more energy on less land. You want to produce more wealth and prosperity if you care about the natural environment. That we've been blinded to that by decades of ideology.
But before we leave the beef issue, because I do want to turn it over to the issue of energy density as well, there is this notion that we should all become vegans and that the best use of the planet is to be growing crops and grains. Can you offer a different perspective on that?
Sure. I mean, this is an area that has been studied quite closely. The best estimates are that if you go vegetarian, you reduce your carbon or your greenhouse gas emissions overall by 2 to 4%. So, and the reason is that agriculture is just not a major source of greenhouse gas emissions. It's mostly energy sector that produces emissions. And going vegetarian doesn't reduce your greenhouse gas emissions as much as you might think. And then when it comes to meat, in terms of land use, the big factor there is just how much land are you going to give to pasture. And if you just concentrate your meat production, you can save a lot of land that way.
All right, let's move over to the issue of energy density, because you've sort of introduced this concept that if you can produce more on less land, you're going to be able to feed more people. Talk about your initial perceptions on wind and solar being the answer, because I kept doing interviews with environmentalists, and it seemed to all come back to this notion that this is the vision, is that everything should be on the electrical grid. We should have electrical heating, electrical cars, our industrial electrical use, and the only legitimate ways to produce electricity are wind and solar with battery backup. If you can tell me if you think I'm mischaracterizing the vision that's put forward, but that seems to come up again and again. And I wonder how you approach that issue of wind and solar, and then we'll talk about why you departed from it.
Sure. So I was an advocate for renewables. I thought that they were the technological fix that we needed for climate change. And I started to change my mind about renewables and nuclear when I started to see the conservation impacts of taking over large desert ecosystems with solar. In California, you require 300 to 400 times more land to use the same amount of to produce the same amount of electricity from solar farms as from a nuclear plant. That's a huge difference. And so you end up in one of our biggest solar farms here, a lot of desert tortoises, which is an endangered species, were killed in making it. Whereas a nuclear plant, you can basically expand infinitely without threatening a single species. So that has to matter if you actually care about the natural environment. And that's a simple concept of energy density. It doesn't really change in different parts of the country. And in fact, California is a sunnier place than most, and it still has those impacts. So, Bill Gates' top person that he relies on the most has done a calculation that finds if 100% renewables would require 25 to 50% of all of our land in the United States. That's an astonishing amount because we use about 0.5% now for energy production. And like I said, 0.5% for cities. So you're talking about environmental impacts that nobody has really contemplated. And it is starting to become more talked about in mainstream. My former colleague is now a professor at Princeton. He did a report recently that found the exact same thing. This is just a function of physics. So no, I don't think we're transitioning to solar and wind. I think the other big problem is we've discovered that the big cost reductions in solar came from producing solar panels with what is effectively enslaved labor in China, which is the Uyghur Muslim minority, who the US State Department says the Chinese government is committing genocide against. So I was just in the Senate testifying a couple of weeks ago, and the senator from Arizona said, he said, we have a serious solar supply chain problem. We can't buy solar panels made by people who people are committing genocide against. That's not consistent with our values. And so that's created a huge wrinkle in the so-called transition to solar.
I guess there's a couple things you could say as well. Then we should source solar from a different place, or we should build solar differently, like put solar panels on rooftops and put solar film on all of our buildings. Does that go anywhere towards addressing the issues?
Well, the first thing you would just have to acknowledge is that if you did source it from some other country, then the cost would go up significantly, and the so-called cost declines from solar panels would have been proven to be illusory, which is what I think they are. But the other factor is something that is unsolvable, which is that we can't make the sun shine more reliably or more frequently during the day. There is no technical fix to the problem of weather dependency. When I testified in front of the Senate, some of the senators asked me to maybe not, if I use the word unreliable about renewables, it would upset renewables supporters. So could I find a different word? So I noticed that Bill Gates was using the word weather dependence. That is the right word analytically. It's the word I've been using. I know that we're now using it more in Texas. I think it's the accurate way to describe why you can't, if you think that we're having more extreme weather from climate change, then you cannot consistently want to rely more on weather-dependent energy sources. You need energy sources that are not dependent on the weather, and that is an inherent unsurmountable obstacle to both solar and wind.
Let's talk a little bit about wind. Does wind have some of the same footprint and biodiversity issues?
In some senses, it's the identical problem to solar in that it's weather dependent and it's energy dilute. On another level, it's totally different impacts. We see that wind turbines kill large birds, endangered birds, condors, whooping cranes are all birds that are in the in the path of wind turbines. They obviously, there's no other energy source that creates energy by spinning blades into the airshed, which is effectively an ecosystem for birds and bats and bugs and insects. So we've had significant ecological effects of wind now. We've been measuring them in Germany. In Britain, there is significant resistance to expanding the transmission lines, which are the #1 cause of mortality for whooping cranes, which is a critically endangered species and very iconic in the United States. So I think that, batteries, nobody even thinks lithium batteries could affordably back up wind and solar. No one even claims that anymore. So I do think that while there's been a lot of mania and enthusiasm for these weather-dependent renewables, I think we're at the beginning of the end of them, honestly.
Let's talk then about the fossil fuel or hydrocarbon based energy that we all rely on so much, because it does drive me a bit bats that you end up with wind getting kind of a free pass on killing all of these migratory and rare birds, and yet we got a huge black eye for the killing of ducks that happened on one of the Syncrude ponds years ago. And so I guess I'm wondering what your perspective is on traditional energy. Maybe we can deal with it in parts. Do you have some thoughts on why it is that Canada's bitumen, Alberta's main export on oil, is depicted the way it is? Is there a fundamental problem you see with it, or is this just a bad communication strategy on the part of the industry? Is there any way to make people feel like that, like bitumen has a role to play in the future?
Well, I think it has to. I think all hydrocarbons have to be understood in the context of energy transitions, which is that it's honestly hard to find anybody except for the very, very extremes, mostly on the left, who will say that that natural gas is worse than coal. Most people recognize that oil and gas are obviously superior alternatives to burning coal or burning wood. It's just obvious. You can burn natural gas in your kitchen. We cook with it. The transportation sector, there's a lot of hype around lithium battery powered cars. I have a lot of questions about it. There's actually a number of most major energy thinkers do not think that electric cars are some inevitability. Many think that hydrogen gas will be the transportation fuel, and they have good reasons for that, including the energy densities, including the time of refueling, and including just the dematerialized, the weight, the power to weight ratio of hydrogen fuel cell cars is so much better. It's just lighter fuel, and you don't require these heavy lithium batteries. So I think there's some real questions that haven't been answered, and I find the headlong assumption that we're going to have electric cars, they're trying to subsidize a particular kind of recharging technology, which could end up locking in bad technologies. So I think that they're by no means, and we're obviously in the midst of a long-term transition from coal to natural gas, and not just in North America, but in Africa and Asia and around the world. So I think some of the assumptions that have been made by, again, more of the extremes in the debate have been unhelpful.
Let's talk about that, because you talk about a long-term transition, and heck, look at what's happened in the last 100 years. Anything is possible in the next 100 years, but we keep getting told we don't have time. We keep getting told it has to be done by 2030. Extinction Rebellion went to the point where they were gluing themselves to buildings and streets and subway cars to draw attention to the fact that humanity was at risk of going extinct. It had a huge impact on kids, especially when you saw the message paralleled with Greta Thunberg. So you're being very dispassionate and logical and moderate in your discussion of CO2, but tell us where does the truth lie? How much time do we have if we're going to have this transition? Do we have to do it by 2030, or is it a 100-year transition? How do you see it?
Yeah, well, and in Apocalypse Never, I talk about Extinction Rebellion, and I think that reveals everything, which is that they were shutting down electric-powered trains. So when Extinction Rebellion targets petroleum, they're targeting electricity that I think in Britain is some of the cleanest electricity in the world, and certainly in Europe. But they're targeting it because it doesn't have anything to do with climate change. It's because they hate civilization. They think that modern democratic capitalist societies are fallen from some prior Rousseauian romantic state of nature. It doesn't really have anything to do with climate change. If they favored climate change, they would support natural gas and nuclear, and they tend to oppose both and favor just importing Chinese solar panels now that we know is made in genocidal conditions. So it's a movement that isn't really about what it's about. I think the product is fear. The goal is to frighten people. It is to terrorize folks. It is to get people to panic. I think we should just take people at what their word is. Greta Thunberg says she doesn't want us to have hope. She wants us to panic. People that want you to panic means that what they want is for you to behave in unthinking ways, because that's what panic means. And I don't want my worst enemies to panic. Even if the world were going to end in 2035 without radical changes, I still wouldn't want to panic about it. And so that's a problem. Look, all else being equal, we would rather not change the temperature of the planet at all. So because we've got a whole civilization and all these natural areas that we've created around a particular temperature and climate. But the point is that not all else is equal, and that we create carbon emissions, we create greenhouse gas emissions because we're trying to improve our lives and also improve the natural environment, reduce our impact on forests, make agriculture more efficient, make energy production more efficient. And the truth is, even on those measures, we're going in the right direction. Carbon emissions are going down in the US and Canada. They've been going down in Europe since the mid 70s. So I think, yeah, fear is their goal. Their goal is to frighten folks. That being said, I do think we need to have a positive agenda, and I think that really means focusing on the transition from natural gas to nuclear, and probably eventually to hydrogen.
Okay, let's talk about nuclear. I thought I'd save the hard one for last, because I think when everyone will have their own touchstone, right? Certain generation will say, "Oh my gosh, love Canal." My generation would probably say, "Oh my gosh, Chernobyl." The younger generation might now say, "Oh my gosh, Fukushima." Like, there is always sort of a touchstone of why we should be terrified of nuclear plants. They don't work. They're going to cause a meltdown. It's going to cause mass devastation if something goes wrong. We can't be too safe. You've got a different take on all of those, and I want you to address those, and then make the case for why we should be looking at nuclear, even if it's natural gas is an interim step, but that eventually.
Sure. I mean, like you, I was raised to be very afraid of nuclear. When I was a 12-year-old, they made us all watch. They encouraged parents to watch with their kids a made-for-TV documentary about nuclear war. I thought that nuclear power plants were the same things as nuclear weapons. I thought that a meltdown at a nuclear plant was the same thing as a nuclear weapon going off. So that was my childhood as well. And I had to learn about energy a little bit. I had to learn that nuclear power plants, they do not have that impact. I had to read the reports about Chernobyl to discover how few people were actually harmed by it. We think a total of 200 people will end up dying over like an 80-year period after Chernobyl. Radiation at those levels just doesn't have the impact that people think it has. I'm from Colorado. We are exposed to much higher levels of radiation, and we have lower rates of cancer and lower death rates. So you really have to be exposed to just really high levels of radiation. I mean, that's the most important thing to know. It's our greatest energy source because of its high energy density. It doesn't create any fire. A Coke can of uranium, this amount of uranium, maybe a little bit more if I'm an American because we consume a lot more. This amount of uranium is enough to power my entire life. At the end of the process, it's just waste and it's safe and it just sits there. It's the best kind of waste. We can protect the natural environment from it. It's the only way to radically dematerialize the energy sector. And if we can dematerialize the energy sector, plus these, humans have a very small impact on Earth. It's a high energy planet. It's a high nature and prosperity planet.
Let me, I don't know if you've seen the show Seaspiracy, but I think when I spoke to you about this last, it has always left me feeling unsettled. I like fish, but I've always worried about overfishing being a huge threat to resources based on some of the work I did at the Fraser Institute years ago. Now I'm watching Seaspiracy and I'm wondering, are we overfishing? Are we ruining our oceans? Is this actually the environmental issue we should be focused on? How do you see it?
Yeah, Seaspiracy is a little bit of the planet of the humans of this issue, in the sense that it gets part of it wrong and then it gets this other part totally wrong. So it gets part of it totally right and part of it totally wrong. It's really simple. 1/3 of the fish stocks, the fisheries in the ocean, are underfished. 1/3 is fished sustainably, and 1/3 we're overfishing. So overfishing is a problem. We have a really good solution to it, though, which is on land fish farms. We don't want fish farms in the ocean. That's where they have the problems that they document on Seaspiracy. That's where they have that's the aquaculture. You don't want to compete with the natural wild habitat. But we have these great solutions on land for farmed salmon that doesn't affect wild ecosystems, produces a beautiful salmon. All the environmental groups are against it because they call it genetically modified. The truth is that everything is genetically modified. It just used different technologies to modify it. So, and now we need to be developing bluefin tuna, as well. And that's going to take a little bit longer. But if we keep pushing hard and keep supporting the technology as consumers, we should be buying high quality farmed fish so we can spare the wild fish in the oceans. And that means we need to support, this is a vision of environment saving really through technological innovation.
Phew, I love fish. I'm glad there's a solution. Let me just ask one final question because we do have to wrap it up. What has been the reaction to your book? I mean, I'm overwhelmingly positive about it, but has it been overwhelmingly positive?
Well, like anything that tries to say something directly and clearly, it's obviously controversial in our media environment. But it's been incredibly gratifying experience. It is a bestseller. It's been translated now into 15 languages. It's out right now in Spain, Italy, and Israel. I'm working on a new book. And, it's been hard because you want to interact with people during the pandemic. And but I've enjoyed the Zoom conversations, but I'm eager to see some of the readers because it's been a gratifying response overall.
I'm so glad to hear it. Thank you so much for the work you do. We sure appreciate it.
Thanks, Danielle.